Colossians 1. In John Piper's book, Don't Waste Your Life, he writes about two missionaries, Ruby Ellison and Laura Edwards, both missionaries in Cameroon, West Africa. Ruby was over 80 years old, was single her whole life, never had kids, and spent much of her life there in West Africa serving the West Africa people. Laura was a widow, a medical doctor, and pushing 80 years old. And both of them in April of 2000 were in a car driving in a mountainous area in Cameroon, and the brakes failed, and they went over a cliff and killed them both. And generally when we hear stories like that, we think, man, what a tragedy. I mean, think about Ruby. She was single her whole life. She never got married. What a tragedy. What a wasted life. In Piper's book, and I want to actually argue the same thing, that her life certainly was not wasted. In fact, I want to argue this morning that Laura and Ruby both lived life to the fullest. And living any life contrary than to focus on the gospel mission and getting the gospel message out is indeed a wasted life. In fact, I would argue that if Ruby and Laura had lived their life in luxury and in comfort and did nothing for the kingdom of Christ in the retirement, it would have been a wasted retirement. This morning I want to talk about the gospel ministry. What is it? How do we go about doing it? And my goal this morning in all of this, my hope is that at the end, you will move a little closer to fully fulfilling the gospel ministry here at Cedar Heights, or perhaps I can put it this way. In the end, we will all move a little closer to embracing the ministry of the cross. Colossians 1, if you would please stand with me as we read. We're going to be focusing, as you can see on the screen, on verses 21 through 23, but to give us some context of the passage, I want to start at verse 19 and read 19 through 23. I'll read the passage, I'll say a prayer, and you guys can be seated. So here Paul is writing to the church at Colossae, and he says this, "For in him," that is in Jesus, "all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell." Now we could spend an entire message on that passage alone, but just to give us some context, keep that in mind. All the fullness of God was pleased to dwell in Jesus, verse 20, and through him to reconcile himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross, in our focal verses. "And you, who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he," that is Christ, "has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you, church, holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all of creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister." Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, you have called us to a mighty purpose, not only here at Cedar Heights, but all churches. And it is so easy to get distracted. It's so easy to lose our focus because of little things that may come up, petty things. Father, I pray that we not lose focus of why we exist here on the corner of MacArthur and Cedar Heights Road. May we forever be about the gospel ministry. May we fully know it. May we fully embrace it. And Father, put aside anything that would slow or hinder your mission here. And it is in Jesus' holy, precious name I pray. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated. So there's something I want to get out of the way real quick as we start out here. Something I know that most of you probably know, but I just want to go ahead and lay the foundations here to make sure that we all understand this. Many times when we think about this term, the gospel ministry, we're thinking, well, that's for ministers. That's for missionaries. That's for seminary students. That's not for me. I mean, I'm just an average church member. I'm not called to the gospel ministry. And if you would make such a statement, and I'm not saying you would, but if you do, that would be a false statement. Because if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you are called to the gospel ministry. If you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you are called to embrace the cross ministry and all that goes along with it. It is not meant just for missionaries or ministers or seminary students. As a matter of fact, as a side note, I remember going down to seminary in 2009. And you would think that seminary students would be the best church members in the world, right? Like they're the ones that are always there. They're the ones that are serving. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. Seminaries are actually having to make pretty strict policies because there's a lot of individuals that like to sleep in on Sunday morning at the seminary. So we're all called to the gospel ministry. It doesn't matter if you're a seminary student, a minister, vocational minister, or a quote-unquote average church member. So this message applies to you. It doesn't just apply to me. So what is the gospel ministry? That's the question I want to answer this morning. And I have three answers. Again, this is not an exhaustive answer. The gospel ministry does not encompass just this. But I do think that Paul is hitting on the pinnacle of the gospel ministry here in verses 21 through 23. I want to break it down and I want to look at the answer. What is the gospel ministry? Let's talk about the first answer first of all. The gospel ministry is this. The gospel ministry is showing individuals how to be reconciled to God. Look at verse 21. And you, he's talking to the church at Colossae, you were once alienated and hostile in mind. Let's talk about that for a moment. What is Paul talking about here? Every single human being that has ever been born, that is alive now and will one day be born, every human being is born with a sinful nature. And because you are a sinful nature that you've inherited from your parents and your parents inherited from their parents all the way back to Adam and Eve, because you have this sinful nature, there is a disconnect. There is a separation between God, a holy, righteous, pure being, and human beings, sinful, impure, sinful nature. There's a disconnect, there's a wall, there's a chasm between us human beings and God. That's the idea here. There's this sort of alienation, this hostile toward God because of our sinful nature. So what are we to do? Human beings, if we can't connect to God, I mean, this is the reason we were created, to have a relationship with God. So what are we supposed to do here? Thus, the ministry of the cross. This is what Jesus did. Jesus came to fill this gap. Jesus came to bridge the gap between a holy, righteous God and a sinful man. This is the ministry of reconciliation, and you and I are to fall in line with that ministry. In other words, the primary reason that Cedar Heights Baptist Church exists, get this, is so that we could be about the gospel ministry of reconciliation. That's what we're supposed to do. As a matter of fact, I will even go this far, okay? And this doesn't make everybody happy, but I'm going to say it anyways. If indeed Cedar Heights ever loses focus of that, I pray God shut us down. Because we are doing more harm than good. We, all of us, have been commissioned by a holy, righteous God to be about the gospel ministry, the ministry that saves souls. You and I are human beings standing on the edge of eternity, encountering other human beings that are standing on the edge of eternity every single day. And you and I are supposed to share the gospel message, the way the individuals can be reconciled to God, the way the individuals can be saved, as our purpose and goal here at Cedar Heights. You know what this means? This is huge. This means a lot. This means that our petty arguments, our little trivial things that we get wrapped up on, and I'm not saying necessarily here at Cedar Heights, but all churches, we need to put them to the side. The idea that we would get so wrapped up over petty trivial things like carpet color and wall color, little things like this, when there is a world, a whole world that is lost and dying and going to hell, shows that at times churches lose focus on what the ministry is about. 2,000 years from now, the complaints that you have, the petty arguments that we have will seem like nothing. We'll look back and we'll be like, why in the world did I get so upset on that now that I'm in eternity? And with Christ, I see that I should have focused on so much more, should have embraced the gospel ministry, the cross ministry, so much more than be focused on these ridiculous, trivial, petty things. Ask yourself this question. Whenever you're getting in an argument with another church member, or whenever you have a complaint, or whenever you want to start a division, ask yourself this question. Is this going to harm the gospel ministry here at Cedar Heights? And if the answer is yes, then let it go. Let it go. Have you ever driven into a town, a southern town, and you see First Baptist Church, Second Baptist Church, Third Baptist Church, and then something like, Calvary Baptist Church, Emmanuel Baptist Church. You see all these Baptist churches, right? You know why you drive into a town of 20,000 and you see all these different churches? It's because we can't get along. We fight over some of the dumbest things. Can I say dumb from the pulpit? Okay, I'm saying some of the dumbest things. Our call, our focus should be to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ, helping individuals that are lost and disconnected from God come into fellowship with God. And yet we get so worked up over things that are just ridiculous. According to the Joshua Project, there's something like 2.9 billion unreached people groups. Unreached people and unreached people groups, rather. Now, these are not all the lost people of the world. This is just individuals that have no access to gospel. Something like 3 billion people. In other words, when you drove here this morning, you probably drove past 2 or 3 churches, maybe more, coming here. 3 billion people live on this planet and they have absolutely no access to the gospel whatsoever. There's not a missionary in that city. There's not a Christian in that city. There's not someone there to tell them. They're lost and dying and going to hell. If they died today, they would be gone forever in a place called hell. And we argue about wall colors. About carpet colors. Do you think when we're standing before a holy, righteous God when we die, you think God's going to say, man, I really liked it? Now, no one here has argued about carpet colors. That's why I'm picking on that. But there are other trivial things that sometimes we get on. But you think when you're standing before a holy God in heaven, and he sees us, he's going to say, man, I really liked it when you started that fight up in the church over the carpet. I hate red. I'm glad you went for the blue. You think God is going to care about stuff like that? Not at all. He's going to ask, who in the world did you share the gospel message with? Were you about helping your fellow neighbor, loving your fellow neighbor? Were you about growing deeper into me, growing deeper into the Word? Those are the things that are important. There are billions of people dying and going to hell. 20,000 of them live within a 5-mile radius of us. We don't have time, brothers and sisters, to argue over petty things. Our focus as a church of Jesus Christ is to be about the ministry of Jesus Christ. And if we're not about that, then you're wasting your time. The gospel ministry is a ministry in which we help people connect to God. Number 2. The gospel ministry is a pursuit of holiness. Look at verse 22. So we are alienated, hostile to God. Verse 22, and he now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death in order to present you holy and blameless. Let me try to connect last point and this point together with an illustration. Here when I was a youth minister 8 years ago, this is actually about 12 years ago, Johnny Tucker was coming in. And this time when he was coming in, he invited a Filipino minister to come and speak at the church as well. I don't know if some of you guys remember some of that. And Charlie asked me to go to the bus station here in North Little Rock and pick up this minister. He was coming from out of town on the bus. I'd never been to the bus station. I even to this day, other than that time, I've ridden a bus, the bus we had here, but I've never ridden a charter bus like that. So I've never been there. So I had to get directions. Once I got there, I was looking around and I'm thinking, this place is disgusting. It smelled, it was run down. And I thought, here's this Filipino minister, an individual that puts his life on the lines at times out where he is. And he's coming to America for the first time, and this is what he sees. And I'm picking on the walls, I'm picking on the smell of the place. This is shameful to say, but I'm looking at the people and thinking, and he sees these people for the first time? I mean, come on. And I don't have a picture. This is before smartphones. I don't have a picture of the guy, so I don't know what he looks like. But Charlie said he'll probably be the only Filipino guy there. So just walk up to someone, an individual that you believe is Filipino, and see if it's the right guy. So I walked up to a guy that was having a pretty intense conversation with someone else. And this Filipino minister spoke a little bit of English. And I walked up to him and introduced myself and let him know who I am. And after we were walking away, I said, so how was your trip, blah, blah, blah. I saw you were having a pretty intense conversation with this individual. Is everything okay? And he said, oh yeah, I was sharing the gospel with him, and I'd just gotten through praying with him. Do you see what happened here? Chad Meeks walked into the bus station, and all he saw was just nastiness, complaints. The Filipino minister walked into the bus station, he saw opportunities. We, as a church, need to push aside some of these petty things. Looking around, and the worst that I've ever heard, one of the funniest illustrations I've ever heard of complaints is people complaining about the bulletin. And I'm not talking about hey, there's a typo here, I wish we had a better bulletin. I'm talking about someone that said, the bulletin is atrocious and the church has issues until they get their bulletin straightened up. And I'm thinking, are you seriously? Are you kidding me? We have so much more to focus on, and you're focused on a bulletin? The church is called to be holy. Now, what exactly does this mean here? I think this is an important element here, and it's kind of a broad element, and I don't have time really to spend on every point here to go along with this pursuit of holiness, but let me note this. As followers of Jesus Christ, we are to pursue the life of Christ. In other words, we are to pursue this incarnate life, the life that Christ lived, how he lived, the ethics he followed, the mission he had. We ourselves are to have that same form of life. Now note this is really important. Notice the spin here. Notice that holiness, here in verse 22, notice that holiness came through, get this is really important. Holiness came through sacrifice. Look at this. He has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy, blameless. You get that? By the sacrifice of Christ. When you repent of your sins and believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, by the sacrifice of Christ, you have been made holy. In other words, this is important. When I say the gospel mission is about the pursuit of holiness, what I see here in this text is the gospel ministry is about sacrifice. Here we go. This is where you don't like me. Follow me here. I've been here 2 months. Okay, 2 months, not long, but I've had a lot of you guys come up to me and talk to me about your own spiritual life. I'm not going to you, you guys are coming to me, even some of the youth. And here's what I've generally heard, overall, that I'm just in a spiritual funk. I'm just in spiritually blah. I don't know where I am, but I'm just not where I need to be. I know, but I'm just spiritually just bland. How do I go to that next level? As a church, follow me here. This isn't going to be a fun idea to hear, a fun truth to hear, but it is the truth. As a church, if we are going to go to that next spiritual level, as an individual, a follower of Christ, if you are going to go to that next spiritual level, it will involve sacrifice. Sacrifice of your time, sacrifices of your resources, sacrifice of your evenings, sacrifice of watching your favorite TV shows, etc. It will involve sacrifice. Go back to Exodus and then Joshua 3. You don't have to turn there. Take your minds there. In Exodus, we know that God has called his people out of Egypt. They cross the Red Sea and they go into the wilderness. They were not meant to stay in the wilderness for 40 years, right? They were supposed to cross the Jordan, but they just couldn't do it, right? It doesn't happen. All of Moses' life, They don't cross the Jordan. They don't cross the Jordan until Joshua 3, until Joshua walks with them across the Jordan. And why? There are giants over there, Lord. We could die. Well, we don't know what's over there. It's the great unknown. We don't know how this is going to happen. We're more comfortable here in the wilderness. I think at times in our spiritual lives, we get really comfortable in the spiritual wilderness. And we got to cross that Jordan into the promised land. And it's not easy. We're scared of the rushing waters. We're scared of the unknown. We're scared of what's over there. I don't want to be too religious, because if I'm too religious, then people will call me fanatic. They'll call me radical. I don't want to do that. I don't want to be too religious, or then my coworkers will think I'm weird. I'm not talking about being a jerk. I'm not talking about being weird. I'm talking about living as Christ has called us to, a life of holiness. If we as a church are going to go to that next spiritual level, it's not easy. This isn't a fun thing to hear, but this is the truth. It will involve sacrifice. And I know some of you are saying, but Chad, I've sacrificed so much already, and that's true. That is very, very true. When I was a pastor of First Baptist Church of Venus, an example of sacrifice and of holy living, when I was pastor there, we needed an air conditioner. One Sunday morning, we get to church. Guess what? The compressor blew on the air conditioner. And it was summer in Texas. Yay! So it was hot that Sunday morning, which was a good incentive when we wanted to raise funds for an air conditioner. But I remember that Sunday morning, the chairman of deacons actually got up and made the plea. I told him, I think you should do this. He got up and said, guys, we got to get a new air conditioner. It's going to cost us about $1,200 because we've got to replace the blower. We've got to replace the outside unit. And we don't have the money. And I remember seeing an elderly gentleman that makes about $30,000 a year walk out of the room, out of the auditorium, and come back 5 minutes later with his checkbook in his hand, ready to write a check. I remember seeing a single woman, a widow, her husband just died of cancer, bring her paycheck to the church, write it over to the church to get an air conditioner. Now, I'm not saying you have to do that. Please don't misunderstand. I've never done that, write my paycheck over the church. Please don't misunderstand me. What I'm saying is they understood that to go to the next level, sometimes it involves, not sometimes, all the time, it involves sacrifice, a willingness to give. And not just money, but yourself. So if you find yourself in that spiritual funk, which I've been there. As a matter of fact, the spiritual life is just about going in the valleys and mountains. That's the spiritual walk. If you find yourself in that spiritual valley right now, and it seems like the valley of the shadow of death, it feels like you have no staff, you have no rod. How do you get out of this? It's going to take sacrifice. It's going to take sweat, it's going to take blood, it's going to take heartache. Are we ready as a church to go to that next step? That's the question. Because this pursuit of holiness, it's not an easy life. The third point that I have here of what is the gospel mission? What is the gospel ministry? The gospel ministry is cultivating and encouraging a lasting faith. Look with me in verse 23. And let's walk through this for a moment. If indeed, Paul writes, you continue in the faith. And here Paul's not saying that you can lose your faith. Paul is saying that a true faith is a lasting faith. Keep that in mind, okay? So Paul is not saying here you can lose your salvation in verse 23. He's saying that if indeed you are a follower of Jesus Christ, then it will be a lasting faith, a faith that continues. Continue reading here. Stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you've heard, which has been proclaimed in all of creation under heaven. Now follow me here, this last part before I home in here on that third point. Which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, in which I, Paul, have become a minister. What Paul is not saying here is that every person at this point has heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's not what's going on here. This is a really difficult passage to translate from the Greek to the English. Here's what Paul is saying. When Paul says the hope of the gospel that you've heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation, what he's saying is there's only one gospel to proclaim. Only one true gospel that everybody can hear. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ. There is nothing else. There is no other way of salvation other than through Jesus Christ. And when indeed you become an individual that is a follower of Jesus Christ, it will be a salvation, a faith that continues. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about the gospel ministry as a ministry that seeks to give individuals not necessarily just to give a quick conversion. The gospel ministry is not just about walking an aisle. There's nothing wrong with walking an aisle, but it's not just about walking an aisle and praying a prayer. The gospel ministry is a ministry that helps to see people's lives completely changed. Jesus didn't say, hey, I just want you to have people walk an aisle. He said, I want you to make disciples, students, followers of me, individuals that are willing to give of themselves. I said this to the youth a few weeks ago, and it was scary when I said it. In all honesty, after I said it, my heart kind of dropped, like, did I just really say that? Kind of just came out. But with the youth that we have here, which, by the way, side note, we have some amazing youth, and I mean that, amazing youth. With the youth that we have here, I told them that I would be happy, I really would, to see them in 20 years, married, with kids, living a comfortable life, going to church, serving in church, still active in the faith. That would just make me so happy to see that. But I would rejoice and weep for joy if in 20 years I open up a magazine or a paper and I see that your name is listed there as an individual that lost their lives for the sake of the gospel in a foreign country or here. I would weep for joy thinking that you were an individual that would be willing to lay it all out for Christ, forgetting the things of this world and pursuing Christ and Christ alone. That's the type of faith we need to seek to cultivate at Cedar Heights. Filling the pews, walking the aisles, those are fine things. But we're called to so much more. The gospel ministry is about cultivating in people a lasting faith, a faith that continues. A lot of times when we hear things like this about the gospel ministry, individuals you generally think something like this. To go, yeah, I like this idea. Chad, I agree with you. We need to go to that next level. We need to pursue the gospel ministry with even more vigor. What program are you going to bring about to get it going? What event are we going to do? Now, this is not an anti-program, anti-event spiel. This is a program of sorts, right? I mean, we're doing a kind of a program right now. So this isn't an anti-program spiel, but follow me here. If you think that to go to that next level, we merely must do another program or, have this cool ministry idea that we can come up with, then you're not getting the point here. The point is, in the gospel ministry, is that each and every single one of you own the gospel ministry. In your own life, in your own circle of influence, at your works, in your neighborhood, here, we own it. Again, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't do programs. But what I'm saying is no one in this room would ever say that, well, I only live like Jesus and I'm a good ethical person when I'm doing a church thing. All of us in here know that we should live like Christ, be an ethical individual, even when we're not at church. The same thing goes for doing the gospel ministry. We don't do the gospel ministry just when we're at church or doing church things. You live the gospel ministry every single day of your life. You embrace it as ambassadors of the cross. That's the gospel ministry, the ministry of reconciliation. It's not easy, I know. Not easy at all, but here's some applications, some thoughts. First of all, this. Ask this question, why are you here? I'm not necessarily talking about at Cedar Heights. I mean, why are you here at a church, period? Like, why do you go to church? The church was never established. Jesus Christ did not die on the cross, suffer an unimaginable type of death and punishment and agony so that we could get together and have a mere social club. There's nothing wrong with relationships. Nothing wrong with friendships. In fact, they're important. But we're here for so much more. Here's what I'm looking, and I talked to some of you about this. Here's where I think we need to go. We need to go where we have a mind shift. Follow me here. Where our mind shifts from the idea that church is about tickling my fancy, playing the songs I want, having the messages I want, preaching the sermons I want, doing the programs I want, a focus from that to a focus of church is all about getting the gospel to the lost world and helping me and my neighbor grow deeper in the faith. We have to have that cultural shift. If we don't, then the epidemic of church hopping would just continue. If you don't know what church hopping is, it's an epidemic that is destroying churches today, where people will go to this church for a couple of years, this church for a couple of years, this church for a couple of years, this church for a couple of years. As long as their fancy's being tickled, they'll go there. As long as honey is being poured in their ears, they're there. But whenever things go awry, well, I'm done. If Jesus has called you here to Cedar Heights, then get on board with the gospel mission. Grab a hold of it. Seeking to reach the people that you encounter every single day of your life and seeking to grow deeper in your faith. And allow God to use you in a way that you might be thinking God can only use Chuck or Deborah or Jennifer or me. Are you ready for this mind shift? Are we ready to go to the next level? Because I'm telling you now, I'm not joking, it's not going to be easy. I'll never forget this illustration. Chuck's given it a million times, but I got to give it again. It just seems to really apply to this. When he was about to go away to Vietnam, you guys remember this illustration? At boot camp, he lined everybody up, the drill instructor did. And the drill instructor was walking among them, and he said, you're about to be shipped off to Vietnam, and I want you to know that many of you will die over there. I can't imagine the fear. I can't imagine thinking I'm standing here in a free country today, but in 3 months I may be over being shot at and killed. I can't imagine. I just can't. The sacrifice, the willingness of giving yourself, it's a great analogy for the gospel mission. Right now, you may be sitting in very comfortable chairs and thinking, yeah, man, I'm ready to do it. Let's go. I'm ready to live the gospel mission. Understand it's going to cost you dearly. But in the end, and then we'll pray, in the end, I promise you, it will all be worth it. And you will say, I would do it over 20 times again if I needed to, for the sake of experiencing the glory of the cross. Let's pray. Man, you guys come. Father, I want to go to that next level in my own life. And I know this church wants to go to that next level. You've taken us so far. You've done so much here in our lives and through this church. I pray by your Spirit, Lord, that your Spirit be speaking and moving through this bald, crooked teeth, skinny 37-year-old, that you would work and move in a mighty way in our hearts that would continue on when we walk outside these doors, so that we may go to that next level of the gospel ministry for your name's sake, for your honor, for your glory. And it is in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Stand with me and sing.
How merciful the cross, how powerful the blood, how beautiful your